Oh, here we are at 5:30. Good evening, everyone, and happy hour and happy Valentine's Day weekend. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you are all here with us. Just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural and romantic heritage, history and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. Well, we call our home the village, but it is also unceded traditional land of the Lenape and Munsee peoples. I want to acknowledge in this archival recording the Lenape and Munsee communities, and especially their elders, past and present, and express gratitude for their stewardship of this land, for contributing to its geography, and for the use of their language as place names. If you'd like to find out more about this, please reach out. I'm glad to offer resources. So just a little bit of Zoom protocol. Our programs associate, my wonderful colleague Lena, is here with us. Hi, Lena. She and I won't be visible during the talk, but we'll be here. So feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, what you're drinking this evening, or if you have any issues or thoughts. And if you have questions for our marvelous guides, we do ask that you please use the separate Q&A function. That will just help Lena to keep track of everything so that we can get to as many of those following the presentation as we can. So thanks for that. And now, of course, I am very pleased to introduce the Literary Pub Crawl. Literary Pub Crawl's in-depth knowledge and underground cult status has brought passion for history, literature, and drinking to the village since 1998. Their Greenwich Village tour is one of the oldest continuously operating walking tours in the village. There are lots of ways to learn more about their work and get involved, so I'm going to put some links for you in the chat, so definitely check them out. Eric Chase is one of the co-founders of Literary Pub Crawl. I'm going to turn it over to you, Eric, so that you can introduce us to your companion here.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's lovely to be back here. This is a virtual experience that we've partnered with the Village Society. Has been a lot of fun and definitely a learning curve for us on trying to maximize some of the technique. And I feel like every time we come back, we found a new twist and a new technique. So any of you who have been on any of our presentations before, you may become somewhat impressed with my mad keynote skills, because this is a new level for me with the mad keynote skills. And any of you who actually build PowerPoints for a living or are graphic designers, I apologize for my bad keynote skills, because I am still a newbie in that sense. But we've been doing physical walking tours through the village, and then later on in Brooklyn and Times Square for about 20 some odd years, until the obvious pandemic situation, which has given us all a little bit of a twist to our lives. But we are looking forward to getting back into action. And so I'm excited to introduce a little new way of us doing these kinds of tours, because we are not doing, hold on, with my skills here, we are not doing the pub crawl this time around. We are doing a literary love crawl and more of a celebrity gossip style. I'm introducing my host, the darling and the dashing Danielle, who is going to be joining us through here. And of course, myself. And as you can see, I learned yesterday how to make GIFs. Very proud of that. I don't think I have any more in this presentation, but my wife is very scared about what will be ensuing here. So that being said, I wanted to stop for a moment and introduce Danielle. She's been with us for quite some time. She was a guide for a while. She now does a lot with our marketing and our social marketing. And she's partnered on several of our virtual tours that we have done. for a while. So cheers and welcome. And thank
Cheers.
you. Cheers. And I think because this is a can be a sensitive topic for some, when you're having conversations about love and sex and gender and relationships, we felt like, and if you're like me, you're probably in a pandemic situation where you might have children running around the house at any moment. So we wanted to make sure that we all understood that we are going to be talking about sex and gender. And Danielle put together a really nice disclaimer that we're going to share with you now. If you would like to read this out for us, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Eric. So just really quick, disclaimer. Although the facts presented to you this evening will indeed be facts, and we indeed will they have been vetted by our producers, yes. Kidding, we don't have producers, we produce this ourselves. We in no way take any responsibility for the results of their airing, whether it be liberation movements, weddings, divorces, slap faces, slapped other places, public displays of sobbing, great novels. Well, okay, maybe we'll take some credit. I mean, blame, so much blame for the great novels. But as the following guests of our gossip channel are deceased, or so we believe for the evidence as of right now, we wish them much peace in the great beyond. But we, however, are here in the here and now, and so we want to bite down on these juicy morals and live vicariously through the saints and sinners of lust and romance on the streets of this old bohemian behemoth. But please fill out the poll. Thank you.
Yeah, so if we could submit that poll now, and if everyone could just graciously click I agree, or if you don't agree, you can click no, I agree, and we will then continue on. Now, I'm sure, as I said, I do have my 6-year-old and my 3-year-old running around. And of course, as a pandemic, everyone is in Zoom meetings. So my wife is in a business Zoom meeting upstairs. I'm downstairs. My kids are running around with macaroni and cheese on their dresses and probably pointy objects in their hands. So I'm hoping I don't hear any screams at any point. But with all of the children around and about, we thought we might want to use some more comfortable words as we begin discussing some of the inclinations of some of the people that we will be talking about. Oh, good. 94% agree. Only a few agree. Now, so as we talk about some of our celebrities and luminaries, we're going to use some safer, more comfortable words as we begin to rank them and where they rate on the Kinsey scale, if you will. So in order to explain this, we'll start with the pileated woodpecker. The pileated woodpecker is a very common North American bird, eastern US and Canada. It is a non-migratory bird. The scientific name is Dryocoppus pileatus. I did look up, if you were wondering what pileated means. Pileated is defined as having a pileus. Now, if that does not explain it enough for you, I did dig a little deeper. As Ariel mentioned, we do dig deep here. And I found the official definition of a pileus is the umbrella-like fruiting structure forming the top of a soft, fleshy fungus, such as a mushroom. So that should clarify all of that out there. They do range about 14 inches long and weigh approximately 12 ounces. And I do want to note that they are non-migratory. Now, our second ranking that will be used is, of course, the tufted titmouse, which is very, very popular and probably the most popular of all of the titmice in the family there. They're very adorable. They have that soft gray and white plumage and the little tuft at the top, which is obviously where they get their name from. They tend to eat a lot of ground foods, nuts, berries, snails. In the summers, they eat a lot of caterpillars. They tend to live 2 to 10 years. And then lastly, our third ranking for the Kinsey scale for us will be, of course, the Titwood Cricket Grounds in Glasgow, Scotland. Now, this is the home for the Clydesdale Cricket Club. It's located in Pollokshields area of Glasgow. In 1876, they began playing here on this field. They were previously playing at Kidding Park. And then they eventually moved next door to Darnley Road, and they bought the Pollock estate in 1987 for £29,000. So thus will be our literary love rankings that you'll see throughout this as we talk about some of the more uncomfortable zones of some of our folks. So that being said, the village has been known for about 100 years. I think somebody once famously quipped that they spent most of their time trying to offend the middle class. As the mores of the middle class tended to lean more towards the left, then the village became even further to the left and finding new ways and measures to offend. So it's no surprise that the village tended to push the boundaries when it came to love, certainly anywhere south of 14th Street, as compared to the more conservative morals north of 14th Street and upstate New York, which is defined as any area that is north of 14th Street or not water. We know love is complicated. We know people are complicated. We know that this is so true because Facebook put a status in relationships that's called "it's complicated." So often things can be a little tricky. But since we're going to go all the way back, I think as a tip to my hat to Ariel, I thought that we would also begin with the Lenni Lenape Indians of the Munsee dialect that were here in Manhattan. As the first residents of the area here. And they tended to be a little bit more progressive, even for the Native American tribes we have. And one of the things that I find is a little difficult when discussing some of that early Native American history is, of course, most of their traditions were oral traditions and were not written language. So we don't have things to refer back to. We have found some tribes tend to have hieroglyphics, but some of them really didn't get the kind of attentions that we would hope that they would. So there's really not a lot there. And obviously, as the West civilized is probably the wrong word, as the West colonized the area, they brought their own predilections and predominant thoughts that they brought to this side. But the Lenape Indians were very matrilineal. They tended to trace their ancestry through their mother's side of the family. They were a little bit more equal of a society as far as genders are concerned. The women tended to be leaders of the community and very well respected. They tended to be in charge of land management and farming and rotating areas of land as they for people who know a lot about farming, they knew a lot more than me. And so they made smart moves with their land. But they also, the men tended to be more of the hunting side. And there were long periods of time where they would separate by gender. And you would have the women in areas doing a lot of the farming and the agriculture, and the men would be off hunting. And because they were separated for certain lengths of time, sometimes intimate relationships between the same genders would develop. And since we don't know a lot about the history of how that developed, we only know it through the Western eyes, and the fact that so many Christian missionaries were very offended by what they were witnessing with these same-sex intimacies. We know that they were keeping the village. They were starting off the village sensibility of let's offend the morals. That being said, let's talk a little bit about how Valentine, since this is a Valentine store, a real brief shout out to how Valentine's became a tradition, or at least where we think the beginnings might have been.
So St. Valentine's Day has been marked in liturgical calendars for centuries. It originally was a Christian feast day, and it's named after two separate saints, Saint Valentine of Rome and also Saint Valentine of Tyranny. Now, we also found some information about a third Saint Valentine in Africa, but there isn't really a lot known. But it only became associated with romantic love during the late 14th century by none other than Geoffrey Chaucer. So we all know him as the author of the Canterbury Tales, but the particular association with Valentine's Day is made due to his poem known as The Parliament of Fowls. You can understand now where we're getting this bird joke from. So it was written sometime in the 1380s, possibly around 1382. So the poem features a parliament, otherwise known as an assembly of birds, and they've all gathered together to choose their mates. And so Chaucer's narrator remarks, "For this was on Sant Valentinus Day, one yellow bird cometh there to choose his mate." Which you can read.
As you read along while she says that, you can see that her pronunciation was perfect.
Spot on. There are several other poets from the time that were writing poems about Valentine's Day for a day of lovers, and those include John Gower, the author of the colossal Confessio Amantis, John Clanvow, and Otten von Grandson. Speaking of Roman Catholics and Rome, the origin of the word Valentine is actually a masculine given name derived from the Roman family of Valentinus, which is derived from the Latin word of valens, which means strong and healthy, which as we start talking about the appetite and love life of some of the writers we're going to get into, you can see why that's appropriate.
Now, Danielle, did you hear that Walt Whitman, while he was known to have had a bit of a well-known affair with the actress Ada Clare, may have also had a bit of a fetish for, I guess, what you could really define as a busboy? Let's find out some more. So Whitman lived at a time where homosexual relationships were sort of held in extreme disregard. And because of this, there's not a lot of mention about some of his relationships. And these are things that we scholars have been able to insinuate much later on, when it becomes easier and easier to sort of read between the lines. We have Whitman here pictured with Peter Doyle, who is the man of his affections. Peter Doyle, the friend of Walt Whitman. Interesting character. He moved at 8 years old with his family from Ireland into the South. And when the Civil War broke out, he actually initially signed up for the Confederacy and fought for the South. He quickly apparently became disillusioned with probably the war and the South, and he tried to get himself honorably discharged. There's some question as to whether or not he was honorably discharged, but he ended up leaving anyways. Eventually, he got arrested a handful of times, both for the South and then eventually the North, where he was a prisoner of war. But eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C., and he began to drive, I guess you could call it, a bus. And when I say bus, we're talking more about the horse-drawn carriage that you have shown here. Here's a little bit of a close-up of a very poor picture. Cameras weren't working so well during that day. Now, I want to read a quote here about these kinds of buses. So it says, "The earliest cars consisted of a single truck coach that measured 15 feet by 7 feet. Passengers entered through the rear." That's a quote. "The coach sat 20 persons on 2 silk velvet benches running along the sides of the car." So this was a mode of public transportation of which he was a conductor. Now, the story of when they met is kind of interesting. And in his own words, he wrote, Peter Doyle writes, "You ask where I first met him, Whitman. It's a curious story. We felt to each other at once. I was a conductor. The night was very stormy. He had been over to see Burroughs before he came to take down the car. The storm was awful. Walt had his blanket. It was thrown round his shoulders. He seemed like an old sea captain. He was the only passenger. It was a lonely night, so I thought I would go in and talk with him. Something in me made me do it, and something in him drew me that way. He used to say that there was something in me that had the same effect on him. Anyway, I went into the car. We were familiar at once. I put my hand on his knee. We understood. He did not get out at the end of the trip. In fact, we went all the way back with me. I think the year was 1866. From that time on, we were the biggest sort of friends." That's from the words of Peter Doyle. Now, within his collection of poems, he has a section that's known as sort of the Calamus poems, and those were entered later on. If you know Leaves of Grass, you know that he reprinted it many times over the years, adding new poems. So in many ways, that one collection of poem progressed and evolved as he as a person evolved, as our nation evolved. And so it's really an interesting three-way, if you will, of looking at the artistic intents of that collection. And many of the Calamus poems are really where scholars are beginning to see more of his leanings towards homosexuality. And there's a great poem from there, which is partially inspired by Doyle. And it's believed that many of the poems in the Calamus section of Leaves of Grass are from Peter Doyle. And he writes, "In paths untrodden, and the growth by margins and ponds aware, escaped from the life that exhibits it, from all the standards hitherto published, from the pleasures, profits, conformities, which too long I was offering to feed my soul, clear to me now, standards not yet published, clear to me that my soul, that the soul of the man I speak for, rejoices in comrades. Here by myself, away from the clank of the world, tallying and talked to here by tongues aromatic, no longer abashed, for in this secluded spot I can respond as I would dare not elsewhere. Strong upon me the life that does not exhibit itself, yet contains all the rest. Resolved to sing no songs today, but those of manly attachment, projecting them along the substantial life, bequeathing hence types of athletic love. Afternoon, this delicious 9th month in my 41st year, I proceed for all who are or have been young men, to tell the secret of my nights and days, to celebrate the needs of comrades." From Leaves of Grass. And you can see his vocabulary was very rich, and in some cases very difficult to read and pronounce. But to get into our aviary rankings that we mentioned here, while he may have started out a little bit of the tufted, I think we are going to, in the end, officially deem him as pileated. And we will continue on now with our next writer.
Well, speaking of surreptitious stolen glances, slide me over one piping hot cup of steamy tea. I think I actually need a little bit of Russian tea for this one for a pick-me-up.
Village tradition.
Village tradition indeed. So Eric, you're never going to guess what I got my hands on. It's a handwritten love letter from one of the most notoriously private, mysterious, and some might even say paranoid, considering the trail of her personal life doesn't exist at all because she destroyed it, Willa Cather.
Oh, handwritten letters. Do people even do those?
I don't know. Do people have hands? So it was written to the great love of her life. And I know what you're thinking, and that might be very cheeky of you, but it is not Nebraska. Her name is Edith Lewis, and she was her literary executor and her lifelong partner for 39 years. Now, I can't reveal my sources because some things should not be known, but I can tell you that this letter was written in real ink, not invisible ink, and I didn't have to use lemon juice or a flashlight or anything like that. So, shall we?
Proceed.
Thank you. Sunday, 4:30 p.m., October 5th, 1936, Shattuck Inn, Jaffrey, New Hampshire. My darling Edith, I am sitting in your room looking out on the woods you know so well. So far, everything delights me. I am ashamed of my appetite for food, and as for sleep, I had forgotten that sleeping can be an active and very strong physical pleasure. It can. It has been for all of 3 nights. I wake up now and then saturated with the pleasure of breathing clear mountain air, not cold, just chill air, of being up high with all of the woods below me sleeping too in the white moonlight. It's a grand feeling. 1 hour from now, out of your window, I shall see a sight unparalleled, Jupiter and Venus both shining in the golden rosy sky and both in the west, she not very far above the horizon, and he about midway between the zenith and the silvery lady planet. From 5:30 to 6:30, they are of a superb splendor, deepening in color every second, in the still daylight sky, guiltless of other stars, the moon not up and the sun gone down behind the mountain gap. Those two alone in the whole vault of heaven. It lasts so about an hour, it did last night. Then the lady, so silvery still, slips down into the clear rose-colored glow to be near the departed sun, and imperial Jupiter hangs there alone. He goes down about 8:30. Surely it reminds me of one of Dante's eternal wheels. I can't but believe that all the majesty and all that beauty, those faded and unfailing appearances and exits, are something more than mathematics and horrible temperatures. If they are not, then we are the only wonderful things, because we can wonder. I have worn my white silk suit almost constantly, with no white hat, which is very awkward. By next week, it will probably be colder. Everything you packed carried wonderfully, not a wrinkle. And now I must dress to receive the planets, dear, as I won't wish to take the time after they appear, and they will not wait for anybody. Lovingly, W. P.S. I don't know when I have enjoyed Jupiter so much as this summer. So you can see from that letter how lovely that is, and also how she includes very mundane facts about her suit.
Yes, I'm curious of how like white silk pajamas are awkward without a hat, but I don't know, it was a different time.
For trying without a hat, because I wouldn't. So while Lee Chun-Li was participating in his meetings of the Wobblies and opening up his tea shop, Willa Cather was preparing to finally move away from the village where she had lived for 21 years, from her house in Washington Square Park all the way up to 82 Washington Place. She had finally gotten to move in with her good friend and companion, Edith Lewis, the lovely lady from the letter. They had met in 1903. She had moved down there a little bit before Willa, and she had moved in 1906, and Cather had stayed with her until she moved into her own place. Cather also got Lewis a job working for McClure's as well, and they got to work together for a little while, which was nice. But it's really interesting when you think about why Willa Cather was living in the village. In Coming Aphrodite, she very subtly established her view of it, which was that it was a quiet artistic community with limited distractions, which is very different than the boisterous bohemian party to which she regularly witnessed, but she did not participate. So some people like to say that love in your soul is found in your eyes, but I'm pretty sure that these days we would call that a voyeur. But it's pretty interesting irony as to, you know, this great distaste she had for the reputation and the many inhabitants of the Bohemian culture. There's an essayist, Andrew Jewell, he once said that living in the heart of the American avant-garde, Willa Cather ignored it. We say, or did she? We'll never know for sure, but what we did know is that she very much hated the likes of the boisterous bohemians who frequented the bar of the Slide. Hey, Eric, you got any 411 on the slide?
I always have a little 411 on the slide. The slide pictured here, and again, pictured here, was a very notorious bar during the late 1800s, one of the seedy dive bars that were very popular in the village at that time, especially for those whose inclinations tended to be held in extreme disregard, as we've mentioned, was very popular during that time. One description I wrote from a newspaper said, "Other dives have become notorious on account of their proprietors or the many crimes that have been committed in them, but the Slide is notorious chiefly on account of its immoral character." So the bar itself evoked immorality. The Slide's most notable patrons went by such names as Princess Toto, Madame Fisher, Maggie Vickers, Phoebe Pinafore, and Queen of the Slide. And what's interesting to me is that there was a young man, a young white doctor by the name of Charles Nesbitt. And he went to this bar one day and he was very intrigued by the colorful personalities. And he wrote a little bit of his reflections on this experience. And he wrote, "Princess Toto joined his table to his surprise, and he found the fellow to be unusually intelligent and sophisticated. Princess Toto, he quickly decided, was the social queen of this group and had pretty clear-cut ideas about his own mental state and that of his fellows. Nature had made him this way," Toto assured the young medical student, "and there were many men such as he." Now, seeing the medical boy's interest, Toto invited him to a ball at Walhalla Hall. That's right, the Walhalla Hall Ball. And it was one of the more prominent clubs on the Lower East Side, that neighborhood that rented out to their affairs to many different folks of many different inclinations, as I've said. Nesbitt went and discovered some 500 same-sex male and female couples in attendance, quote, "waltzing sedately to the music of a good band," which apparently was shocking to him. And along with the male couples, there were, quote, "quite a few masculine-looking women in male evening dress dancing with other women, many of whom seemed to have impressed the student as being of good background. One could quite imagine easily," he recalled, "in a formal evening ballroom with respectable people." And that was the type of company there at the Slide, and obviously you see how the perceptions of that, even in the village, were as of the late 1800s.
Well, speaking of respectable people, let's talk about the notorious Don Juan Maxwell Bodenheim, along with the millionaire Robert Claremont and Eli Siegel and John Rose Gildea, who all founded the Greta Garbo Social Club. Their sole agenda was to deflower virgins. So I'd really like to see what the memo lines there looked like. But we know Maxwell because he achieved some success by writing numerous novels, mostly of a very sexual and very scandalous nature. His best-selling novel, Replenishing Jessica, that's like a title enough. It was so scandalous that he actually was faced with obscenity charges. And when they went to trial, their strategy to win was to read excerpts to the jury, and the jury promptly fell asleep. In response to Replenishing Jessica, our favorite mayor, Jimmy Walker, famously quipped that no girl was ever seduced by a book.
Well, now, that is not what Floyd Dell told me.
You got some dirt?
Absolutely.
Man.
Yes, Floyd Dell and I had a conversation, sort of indirectly, through a few hundred years, not hundreds, 80. But Floyd Dell said that the secret to seduce Millay, Edna St. Vincent Millay, was to convince her of the superiority of Freud to Plato. He was apparently very successful at that tactic, saying that Freud is greater than Plato equals Millay, as you can see from our math diagram here, for those of you who are not heavily into math. For more gross tactics to seduce a lady, check out our new online tabloid column, Post Malaise.
Speaking of tabloids, we explained it.
I can't take credit for that joke. That is Danielle's. That is a Danielle original. I just
really nice work.
Speaking of tabloids, Maxwell had 2 love affairs with women who very sadly killed themselves after he ended the affairs, and he was a tabloid regular. But he also had a good friend. In 1923, his good friend, Ben Heck, wrote a novel called Count Brugge, which had a caricature of a bohemian poet, which was apparently exactly like Maxwell Bodenheim. He did not like that very much. So in typical fashion, as we all do, he responded with his own book of poetry called Advice. One poem in particular was called Poor Friend. Your head is steel cut in drooping lines. They make a mask satirically meek. Your face is like a tired devil weak from many vapid, unsought wines. The sullen skepticism of your eyes, forever trying to transcend itself, is often entered by a wistful elf who sits naively unperturbed and wise. I like to call that a bohemian burn book. So his good friend is important because much later in Maxwell's life, he got into a deadly end with his then wife, Ruth. And by wife, I meant he met a very rather attractive younger woman who was also a homeless drifter, because at the time she was a homeless drifter, as was he. And on February 6, 1954, they met a third homeless drifter, and his name was Harold Weinberg. He invited them to stay in his motel room, which they gladly accepted, because Ruth was also having an affair with Harold. Harold was 26 years old, and he was a scarred man. And obviously none of these people were able to stay faithful to one another. But that night, Ruth thought that Maxwell had passed out drunk, and as one does, Ruth and Harold decided to make love. Maxwell awoke and was outraged. So they began fighting, and in the scuffle, Harold ended up shooting Maxwell and then stabbed Ruth, and then fled and made it try to seem as though they had both been killed by a robber. Neither of them survived. When Harold Weinberg was eventually put on trial, he announced to the court, "I ought to get a medal. I killed 2 communists." He was committed to the state hospital for the criminally insane. But you remember Maxwell's good friend, Ben Heck. Turns out he was a good friend, and rumor has it that Ben paid for Maxwell's funeral in New Jersey, which would have been almost 30 years later since their burned Bohemian bucks.
Now, another den of decadence with denizens of immoral and impressionable youth was a place called Cushman's Cafe. Now, Cushman's Cafe was really popular with the flappers of the 1920s. And all of this really kind of came about because, ironically, of Prohibition. So pre-Prohibition, if you were a woman who was alone at a bar, you would be arrested for being a woman alone in a bar, because the assumption is that you were a prostitute. Once drinking became illegal for everyone, all of a sudden it was a level playing field. And this is really when you began to see a lot of the young women going out alone and in groups and becoming much more socially active and vibrant. And you really see a big turning point in many areas of society with the feminism and women's rights movement. And so much of it is because they made drinking illegal. Now we have a picture here of some flappers and some flappers in London over here, but at Cushman's was a place that was participating in an activity that was growing popular, and it started in 1915, but it really took off in the 20s, and it was known as the petting party. And yes, it is exactly what you think it is. Here is probably one of the more famous photos of some people who are there in a bit of a petting party situation. This is also known as necking, spooning, mushing parties. It was known as snuggle pupping for a while. And it really was an exploration of younger people to explore their sexuality without quite going all the way towards sex. Now, as you can imagine, even in the 1920s, there was a lot of moral outrage about these activities. It was believed that they were tearing away at the fabric of our society, and they were encouraging girls not to settle down and get married right away, which at the time is what they were supposed to. So there were many attempts to sort of squash and break apart these petting parties that were going on. And one of them was sort of a famous arrest in the village at Cushman's in 1923. I love the headlines: the flappers petting den that exploded Greenwich Village. A whole slew of mostly young women were arrested and taken over to Jefferson Market, where they were arraigned for a lot of these illegal activities. And it was such a big to-do in the papers at the time that they even posted a map with a layout of the bar showing you exactly where the petting was going on at that time. I love that they went to this level of description in the newspapers. But it was what I sort of find interesting here is that they had a few Q&A questions that were from the stenographer's report of some of the things that were going on there. And this one in particular I really liked. Were you there with anyone in particular? Why, no, not particular. Who was the person you went in with? I don't know. I met him outside. Never seen him before? No. And then, what did you do when you saw Miss Genevieve McLaughlin, the police officer? Did she say anything to you? The answer, she asked me to stop dancing that way. What's that way? How were you dancing at the time? We were dancing there and she told me to dance with my back straight. How was he dancing with you? He was leaning right over me. So as you can see, this is obviously a big inspiration for Footloose. Footloose was important. The youth do need to dance, and Greenwich Village, once again, is inspiring the cultural folks around the world. Now, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Sayer were moved out in Long Island, but Fitzgerald had written a little bit about this phenomenon of petting parties. He coined the term the flapper girl. He was really a big advocate for the youth and the young during the 20s, during Prohibition. And he was interviewed a few days after the arrest. And he wrote about it. He said, "Prohibition is the cause of the conditions found in such places," said Fitzgerald. "Half of the young people who get drunk or go to shady cabarets do so simply because Prohibition has made an adventure instead of a disgrace of such parties. Say verboten to youth, and you challenge youth. When youth is challenged, it will make itself heard and felt, for in the end, youth is irrepressible. Those girls at Cushman's weren't vicious any more than the flappers in my novels are vicious. Why not raid the really nasty cabarets uptown? I've seen far more indecent dancing and drinking there, and for that matter, in the homes of our very best people than ever took place in Greenwich Village dance halls. Petting parties didn't hurt a girl so much as a lot of reformers would have led us to believe." Now, all of the real sexual exploration and some of that movements that were happening there could almost be solely brought down to Henrietta Rodman. She's often seen as the person who kind of turned the village into much more of its reputation that we know of today as being very progressive, as sort of pushing the boundaries of rights and equalities, feminism, equal rights movements, artistic, socialism, all of those things that get us to tea parties, everything kind of gets associated with the village, kind of comes down to Henrietta Rodman. And when she moved the Liberal Club from where it was uptown down into Greenwich Village on McDougal Street, right above where Polly Holliday's cafe was. At the time, the Liberal Club at Uptown was mostly a male board. She was getting bored, and she felt that the liberalism was getting a little too conservative, so she wanted to push the boundaries some more and moved it down there. And really, you kind of had the explosion that the Floyd Dells and the Malays and the Provincetown Players, the W.D. Du Bois, and all those people could really take off because of the environment that she was creating there. Now, she's sort of known because she'd supported herself as an English teacher for a while, and she found out that there was a law in the books that said you could not be an English teacher and remain married. If you started working as a single woman and you got married as a woman, you had to leave. This was only for women. Men, whatever, you're a teacher, you're a teacher. But for women, once you're married, your marriage would corrupt the morals of the youth. Seems a little backwards to our viewpoints now, but at any rate, she thought this law was ridiculous, as it was, and she got married and fought it and lost, and she ended up losing her job as a teacher. But it really did help propel a lot of that feminist movement and getting those laws eventually changed. She was also known to have been wearing sort of the bobbed haircut long before it was popular. She cut her hair short. She was encouraging girls to cut their hair short, smoke cigarettes, and stop wearing tight-fitting corsets. And she was also known for her marriage because she tended to have a bit of an open marriage. She was one of the first ones to really kind of talk about it at the time. She was living with her husband and her husband's ex all together, and they sort of explored that development. She was also for a short time a nudist, where she would greet people who came over nude and introduce them to her husband and her husband's ex, all living there together. But really, she's often forgotten now, and it's kind of unfortunate unless you really do in-depth village history, because she really is an iconic figure that so heavily shaped what we know of as the village, as I mentioned. And we like to think that she encouraged the young women to shock the neighborhood by walking outside alone, smoking a cigarette with ankles exposed, which was shocking for that time. Miss Henrietta Rodman.
Speaking of liberated ladies, guess who was married to two men at once, had affairs with both Henry and June Miller, Gore Vidal and Edmund Wilson? Over.
Did she have a lot of box of lies under her bed to keep her facts straight? Hugh loves chicken and Rupert loves steaks? My guess is Anais Nin. Over.
If you don't want to spend Valentine's Day night alone, spend it with a saucy copy of Nin's, which is basically erotica. #SpawnCon. I would not BYOB, bring your own book, with her on the byline in public, unless you're into that type of titmousing. Over.
Oh, roger that. Edmund Wilson. Why does that ring a bell? Edmund Wilson.
Wasn't he?
Edmund St. Vincent Millay. We'll get to her in a moment, but first we should skip ahead a little bit to the 1960s and the Beats, where there was another probably more well-known and popular sexual exploration that was going on at the time. We won't go into too heavily the details, but many of these people you see here, Corso, Ginsberg, Burroughs, Cassidy, Kerouac, all did a lot of different experimentation during their times on the pleasures of the soul and the body. But the couple that I did want to kind of point out a little bit more quickly is Amiri Baraka, at the moment in this picture, is Leroy Jones before he changes his name, and Diane DePrima. He was married at the time that he was working with her when they were publishing The Floating Bear over in the East Village together. And I don't recall if she was married or not, but they certainly had an affair for a good period of time while they were working together. Eventually, they had a child together, Dominique, I believe was her name at the time. He was very popular. He got his notoriety in the Beat movement because apparently he wrote a letter to Allen Ginsberg after reading Howl, and he wrote it on a roll of toilet paper, and it basically said, "Are you for real?" Ginsberg read this letter and responded, I think, a normal paper, yes. And a friendship ensued. And Ginsberg is really kind of what brought Amiri Baraka into the Beat fold. Now, for Diane DePrima, she had already published a few poems here and there. And in fact, Lawrence Ferlinghetti had written a review of some of her poems saying, this is a new voice, this is a new sound, and it's very engaging. But her real notoriety came when she published a book called Memoirs of a Beatnik. And it was about a lot of her early years hobnobbing with many of the famous beats at the time, and some of her early experiences trying to break through as a writer, as a poet, while working with some of them. And she started introducing a few sex scenes into this book. And her publishers continued to read the new version, send it back with simply the words scrolled, "more sex," written on a note in the book. And she would submit it again with more sex, and they would reply, "more sex." And so it kept going on until eventually it gets published and became a little bit of a softcore erotica to it. She later admitted that most of the events in that book were true, except for a lot of the sex. But she later came out with a book more recently called Recollections of My Life, where she was much more honest, not only about the moments of her time with the Beats, but also of her own sexual exploits, which had a little bit more truth to them. Also in the 60s, I did want to mention Lorraine Hanbury, who I think is it's a really interesting story to think through of her love life. Now, she is best known for writing Raisin in the Sun, which is a play that just exploded onto Broadway. And then very quickly, they made a movie of it as well. And it's a very powerful play if you've never read it. And she wrote most of it in Bleecker Street, right? 307 Bleecker Street, I believe, right on the corner of Bleecker and Christopher Street. And while she was writing it and while living there, she was married to Robert Nemiroff, who you can see pictured here. And they remained very, very close, even after her wealth and fame got her to learn a little bit more about herself, and they eventually divorced. But they remained close friends all through the divorce, and he is the executor of her estate after she passed away at a very young age, I believe pancreatic cancer. But what was being discovered is that she was coming to terms with her own lesbianism. And it's actually said that on the opening night of Raisin in the Sun, they had an after party at Sardi's up in Midtown. And there were several women who were talking about their experiences when it was clear that she was flirting fairly heavily with them, several of them who would become their lovers. But her relationships and sexuality post-divorce was very secret. She didn't talk about it a lot. While she was very active for social movements and equal rights movements, and she was a big proponent of equal rights for all genders and sexes and relationships, but she didn't really talk a lot about her own personal experiences. It is believed that when she moved, there was a woman who lived upstairs, an older woman named Dorothy Secules, who was believed that they had a long-term relationship. And Dorothy took care of her for the last few months of her life while they lived in that building. But it wasn't until after her death that more excerpts from letters and diaries came out that really began to see just how she was struggling with and eventually coming to terms with her sexuality and some of her relationships. In fact, she may have had even more than was really known about before. And you can't really blame somebody for that. I mean, a person's love life is their own. It's their own business. But for those of us who kind of get fascinated with trying to understand some of the great artists and writers and what moved them and what how they understood themselves, it's illuminating in some ways to learn, and especially someone who's just so powerful, charismatic, evocative, and just how she was coming to terms with her own relationships, and how lucky to have married somebody who's really understanding, because not all people go through divorces or understanding, especially when there's a change in sexuality as well. But I think at this point we need to pass off to our last icon that we should talk about here.
Yeah, Eric, a quick question. What do you get when you stick 2 beets on a cricket court?
What?
Avian flu.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Joke.
The worst of them all. Thank you for the worst joke on the tour. We've gotten past that now. But our final participant, Miss Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Well, speaking of understanding, we finally arrived to the one and the only, and as you well now know, the woman who has put forth the idea that every woman has the right to sexual pleasure and no obligation to fidelity. In 1921, she published A Few Figs from Thistles, in which she described female sexuality in such a way that it gained her a lot of notoriety, particularly because there were a number of passages that were very much distinctly lesbian in nature. But she was openly bisexual and she was married to a man. So I would like to share with you an ode to her love of love. What my lips have kissed and where and why. What my lips have kissed and where and why I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. Very beautiful poem.
No, it's a beautiful
It would
one.
be more beautiful if I could not flip words around. While Seb Vassar, she loved many women, and many women were in love with her. But one particularly that she fell in love with was a woman who was 15 years her senior. Her name is Edith Wynne Matheson. And so she wrote this lovely note that I had found and did not dig this out of a trash can, but I will share with you. I will do whatever you tell me to do. Love me, please. I love you. I can bear to be your friend, so ask of me anything, but never be tolerant or kind, and never say to me again, don't dare say to me again, any way you can make a trial of being friends with you, because I can't do things that way. I am conscious only of doing the thing that I love to do, that I have to do, and I have to be your friend. Also very beautiful. She had many friends, 2 of which were indeed friends themselves. You had Arthur Fick, who was the lover of hers. You had Hal Biner, who was a lover of hers. And she liked to write them both letters, pairing them off with the thought of marrying one another. So in this one from 1922, it's a letter to Hal, and it says, "It is true that I love Arthur, but we have all known that for some time, haven't we? I shall love him always. He is something to me that nobody else is. But why should that trouble you, Hal? Don't you love him too? Don't you love several people? If you loved me, I should not want you to love only me. I should think less highly of you if you did. For surely one must be either undiscerning or frightened to love only one person when the world is so full of gracious and noble spirits." Also very beautiful. She married neither of them. Her husband of 26 years was Eugene Dan Boysen. They had an open marriage, and she made many more friends. He made less friends than her, as I think we all do, but he understood that she needed these very good friends to give her the inspiration for her work and what beautiful work she created. But some of these friends included Floyd Dell and George Dillon. Her and Bossevin died within 1 year of each other, and that's where our story today ends. But I will leave you, my little Parliament of Fowls, with one last quote about letters. She writes, "Please give me some good advice in your next letter. I promise not to follow it."
Oh, very nice. Thank you, Danielle. And that is sort of the quick wrap up of a real, just kind of a flavor sprinkling of some of the many complexities of the relationships of some of the more well-known and slightly lesser known figures of the village. There are many, many more. We could talk for hours and go into more and more detail, but we did kind of want to hit some of the different movements and some of the different peoples that lived there through that time. You can see here, and I know they're going to post the links as well. If you want to follow us on any of the social medias, I will say my recent soapbox when it comes to social media is I feel conflicted because the way society is today, we kind of need social media to get the word out, to get people to find out more about us. It is sort of a major force of advertising. I also think that unlike petting parties, this really is tearing at the fabric of society, which we've seen lately. So I completely respect if you are not of the social media style and do not follow people on there. We are a force for good. We're a force for positivity. I would rather see you reading a book and writing a poem than simply searching and liking photos on Instagram. But if you are the type to keep tabs on the world, feel free to follow us. And if not, go write a poem, fall in love, read a book, embrace the world, and help pull society back together, because gosh knows we really need it right now. But with that, we'll certainly take any questions that we can. And we really appreciate you taking a little time on this happy hour to join us here on our tour.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. That was so wonderful. So now is a really great time to ask questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A. But I have a question in the meantime, as people are still thinking. So you mentioned that Cushman's was a major site of some romantic and sexual controversy or debates. And I'm wondering if there are any other spaces, whether it's other bars or public spaces, that have had like similar controversial histories.
Well, I think you could probably say almost any of the bars at that time would have had a certain degree of that. I mean, I think more famously is obviously the Stonewall Inn, which I think most people are probably familiar with on this, and really the birthplace of the gay rights movement. So that was another place that was sort of known for it. We had mentioned the Slide. There was Grange Hall, which was probably a little bit more revolutionary than in dealing with sort of the sexuality. But there certainly was a seedier aspect to that side of it. That was on Commerce Street, where it turns around into Barrow, or Cherry Lane now. I mean, gosh, there's so many of them. The Redhead during Prohibition was really kind of known as a bit of a divey bar to get a drink, and that was the first bar that Jack and Charlie ran that would eventually become the 21 Club when they moved further uptown. But yeah, there's just so many. Marie's Crisis, even more recently, I think, has had that. But when you really look at anything that was pre-1800s, I mean pre-1900s, in the village, is probably going to be a dark side. A dark side is the wrong words, but there's probably going to see a untraditional side to some of the activities that were happening there. Most of those places are sadly long gone now.
Definitely. Thank you. So we got a question from Gail. Gail wants to know, Gail is wondering about contemporary or more recent literary figures, though she understands if you don't want to talk as much about those still around.
I don't like the living. They're just, you can't understand them.
So true.
It's actually a great question. And, it's funny, Gail, I appreciate you bringing that up, because one of the things that I struggled with, and I've been doing the store from the beginning in 1998, that for several years I began to realize I was only reading dead authors. And it came from a point of by doing this particular tour, these tours in the village, I didn't just want to relay information about an author. I want to have read somebody that I'm talking about. And so I began making it a goal to really read at least one novel by all of the people, and discovered so many writers that I never would before. But then I kind of fell behind on who are the current writers and what are the current movements. A few years ago, New York City did a great push, and I don't know if they've done it again, but it was this idea of like everyone read the same book. Not sure if anyone remembers that. It's basically came down to 5 books to pick to try to see who would do it. I don't think I picked the winner, but I did pick Jennifer Egan's book, Manhattan Beach. And partially because it really touched on a couple of areas that were, because we have a Brooklyn tour and they were doing a lot in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Navy Yards, as well as we have our Midtown tour that we were developing. And there was a lot going on during the Prohibition years there. And this is it's a really wonderful, wonderful read. And it deals with the heroine is a young girl who starts working during the war because they're in need of people, and she works in the Navy Yard, and she's trying to deal with the kind of work she wants to do, but women don't do that kind of work, as well as her trying to sort of find the mystery of what happened to her father who disappeared when she was young, and what's becoming more clear relationships with the mob that her family may have had. And so Egan does a great job of intertwining, trying to work during the war, trying to deal with the sort of misogyny that was going on at that time, trying to deal with the mob scene and in the clubs that were going uptown. And it's a very wonderful and fun read. Trying to think of some of the other ones that are more recent. Again, I've been reading a lot of Baldwin lately. Of course, he's not really a living and modern writer. Not village related, but Cormac McCarthy is a writer that I really enjoy, and I enjoy his style of prose. But my reading list is constantly kind of growing. Unfortunately, the village is not really a scene for many new up and coming writers anymore, because they can't afford it as much. You have more of like the Jay McInerney lived there for a while, and the Olsen twins were there for a while, but I don't know that they wrote anything. But I'm always open for more. Who incredibly loud and extremely close. Everything's illuminated. Jonathan Safran Foer.
He lives in the village?
No, but he's a living writer that I've read.
Oh, okay.
That I really like, heavily in New York. Jonathan Makem, Motherless Brooklyn, is another fantastic read. They just made it a movie with I can't think of the actor's name, the Fight Club guy, Edward Norton, and it's about a private detective in 1950s Brooklyn who has Tourette's, and he's trying to solve them.
Edward Norton actually is a villager.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, is he? There you go.
Connection.
There you go. 6 Degrees of Edward Norton.
I'm wondering, and I'm not sure, I think, Gail, this is maybe what Gail was getting at, but are there, who were the people who were left off of this list? I'm wondering who maybe you were considering adding in, but didn't, if any.
Oh, that's
who are other contenders for this?
Because we were kind of going back and forth as we were sort of cycling through some of the people to talk to. Obviously, I mean, Kerouac was somebody that I could easily have talked about, but I feel like I talk about him too much. So I didn't want to talk. I wanted to try to talk about people that I don't always get to kind of hit on a little bit. It actually would have been interesting to explore some of Thomas Paine's views on sex and sexuality, because he sort of remained a bachelor through most of his life. So it might have been interesting to kind of dig deeper in that beyond his historical. Dawn Powell could have been a real fun one to talk about. Dorothy Parker, I think we almost put her in. But again, trying to keep a certain pace and keep it within, roughly a 45-minute to an hour time period that you can't really touch on it a lot.
I was gonna say, like, we also had Bob Dylan on the list.
Sure.
And I mean, like, oh, I think my internet just froze. Oh, I'm back.
Yeah.
Sorry. But like, I honestly feel like pretty much a lot of the writers that are on our tour could be contenders for this, because, as we said, like, the idea of living in the village was to offend the morals of the middle class, and they were all doing that in their own way. Which now we look at it and we don't really find any of their actions to be offensive, which is also kind of interesting to think about how society has shifted.
That's a great point.
But Dylan Thomas could have been another one that we talk about. It's Audre Lorde was on the list at one point. And it's really trying to get a cross section of the people that are known, the people who are lesser known. What makes an interesting through line? What can we do fun with PowerPoint? Kind of sprinkle it out there. But I mean, there's literally hours and hours and hours of information that we could go into, but you don't want to sit through that.
Having to do with the PowerPoint, the artistry, we were wondering as well if you could explain how you came up with the bird watching Kinsey scale.
What were we talking about?
How did that come up? I don't know.
We're talking about something. Oh, because I think we wanted to have some kind of I think I said something about, I think I was like just like making fun of like nothing, and I think I was just like, he's a real woodpecker. We were trying to come up with like you go girl cat calls that like were like positive, but like meant nothing.
I feel like it came out of because we were talking about maybe having Woody Guthrie on the tour, and then you made the joke of like, yeah, but did he date him? And what are you going to say? He dated a log?
A log.
That's where it came from, the log to the woodpecker to like, oh, that's a funny innuendo that may or may not. I actually felt that out with a couple of people. I'm like, is that pushing it, or is it okay? But it was, I had a lot of fun creating those heart-shaped pictures of the birds. The little things that will amuse us during a pandemic.
We need that. Important. Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to come in and laugh a little bit with you at the end.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day. Get off your phone, get off your social media, hug a loved one, write a letter. That was what you wanted me to tell Danielle. Write a handwritten letter to someone from your past. I think we all should do it. It's a lost art. And it is something that our generation, some of my generation and those, the slightly before me, will have some traces of what it was like when we were young. Because I wrote in journals. I have journals from when I was young. I have some letters. I don't have anything from really my 30s on. And for the next few generations, if digital gets lost, I mean, I have stuff I wrote on the Apple IIe on a disk I'll never see again. And technology, while making it easier, so much of what we know, like what we know about Edgar Allan Poe, what we know about Edna St. Vincent Millay, comes from her letters, from Lorraine Hansberry. It's her letters and her diaries. And so much of our generation and our artists and what are known about our time could very well be lost by somebody wiping a hard drive. And so I would encourage you, be remembered, write a letter.
I appreciate that so much.
I'm going to write that down.
And I love your Valentine's heart, Ariel. It's a nice touch. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's better than the poor lawyer who was a gopher during a trial. He was a cat.
That's the reason why I was playing with the filters. Yeah. This would be a little less intrusive.
Yeah, I'd read earlier a woman who had like turned herself into a potato during a presentation with like CEOs and couldn't change out of it and had to do her whole presentation as a talking potato. Yeah.
I wanted to share a Valentine's Day related astrology fact that came up during this presentation that I personally loved. So the letter from Edith Wharton's partner was absolutely lovely, and she talked about the conjunction of Venus and Jupiter. Yep. And that is something that happens a few times a year, and it actually happened yesterday.
Yep.
I believe it's still. Is that why it was chosen?
Yeah, that's why I chose it.
Okay, wow. Because I was going to say the coincidence is too crazy.
I'm an astrology freak, and I was looking, and I was like, "Ooh, like this is like a real letter." And she really didn't have many. There's a whole letter project online, where there's tons, but there aren't really a lot of love letters. So that's like kind of what makes it interesting. But yes.
That's amazing.
That's so great.
That's so cool.
Well, probably, I think Millay is so representative of so much of the village, but I think she wrote a really short poem that probably defines what all romance was like in Greenwich Village. And if I loved you Wednesday, well, what is that to you? I do not love you Thursday. So much is true, and why you come complaining is more than I can see. I loved you Wednesday, yes, but what is that to me?
Well, for a weekend about celebrating love, I think that is a great way to wrap this talk. Thank you, Eric and Danielle, so much. Thanks for everyone who's here with us. Have a good night. Stay warm. Enjoy each other, and as safely as possible.
Yes, safely as possible. Take
Take
care.
good
Stay strong.
care.